we're going to stick with the economic theme and delve deeper into the circular economy. It has an essential role to play on the road to decarbonization and the creation of inclusive, sustainable economies. Now, the circular economy can accomplish quite a lot. It designs out waste and pollution. It keeps products and materials in use for as long as possible. It regenerates natural systems and is necessary to tackle the root causes of the climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution crises, all of them. So here to tell us more about the circular economy is David McGinty. He is the Global Director of the fast-growing Platform for Accelerating the Circular Economy located in The Hague. Previously, he has led public-private partnerships for an international NGO, served as the head of a private sector development and impact investing advisory firm, and has taught graduate-level courses in management and law. David, welcome to the Sustainability Symposium.
Hey, thanks. Excellent, thanks. Well, thanks for having me, everybody. I think what I'll do is I'll go through a little bit and help level set about what we mean by the circular economy, and then talk about where we're going and where we can go, some bright spots that are out there, share a few specific ideas around the built environment, and then a few kind of ways forward. And I'm happy to have a more robust Q&A session. So some of my remarks are going to be high level, some will be esoteric, and some will be very specific and tangible. So hopefully there'll be something in there for everyone. So like Mike said, I'm David McGinty. I'm the Global Director of PACE, the Platform for Accelerating the Circular Economy, which is a coalition of around 100 CEOs and ministers, mostly ministers of environment, who are championing work on the circular economy. And, so what is that? I like simple explanations. I'm originally from Alabama, as you might be able to hear. And so for me, straightforward things are good. So, one definition I like is that a circular economy decouples or delinks economic activity from the consumption of finite materials. So we separate the idea that we have to consume more stuff in order to drive economic activity. If you go a little deeper, I would say a circular economy is about business models that do three things. Business models that design out waste, that keep materials in use at their highest value for as long as possible, and that return value back into the system. So return materials back into the system so that it can regenerate. And so, a circular economy is much more than recycling. And sometimes it gets kind of bucketed into that area. Recycling can be a component, but to be honest, it's actually the last thing that you want to think about. So we're usually talking about things about how do we have an economy that is regenerative by design, that explores alternative materials, design innovations, durability, longevity, optimal reuse, refurbishment, remanufacturing, and the like. Then we talk about recycling of products and materials. So why does it matter? Why is it urgent? There are a lot of reasons, but I'll share a few. More than 100 billion tons of resources enter the economy every year, everything from metals, minerals, and fossil fuels to organic materials like plants and animals. And of those resources, that resource use has tripled since 1970 and is set to double again by 2050. So again, 100 billion tons of resources enter the economy every year. It's tripled since 1970, and it's going to double again by 2050. And currently, we're using the equivalent of what would be about 1.5 Earths if we scaled up that consumption pattern. And we're using Earth after Earth with only 8.6% of that material that we use being cycled back into new products. So 100 billion coming in and only 8.6 coming back in. And along the way, what that's doing is the consumption and production of our products is contributing about 45% of greenhouse gas emissions. That's just one example of the potential of the current impacts. But what's the upside of shifting that production and consumption? When we talk about the circular economy, Accenture's put the target at a $4.5 trillion economic opportunity by avoiding waste and making businesses more resource efficient. So the new models that focus on reuse, repair, remanufacturing, and sharing models offer a lot of that value. And if you just take, for example, using less plastic waste in the ocean would benefit industries like fishing and tourism, whereas plastic pollution currently is an economic cost of $13 billion. So we want to shift cost into increased potential benefits. The circular economy also offers economic or employment opportunities. So transitioning to this green economy, these types of approaches that we promote look to create about 24 million global jobs by 2032 and that includes offsetting potential job losses. And then finally, by doubling global circularity from that 8.6 to 17.4% in the next 10 years, we'll be able to ensure that the world is on track to meet the Paris Agreement. Without addressing materials, we won't be able to do that. So how did we get here? So maybe let's just take a step back. This is the esoteric part. It's a little bit simple, esoteric, but like kind of basic economics here. And I think COVID-19 really emphasized this issue for us, that for the first time in history, or say for a unique time in history, we're facing what I would call a single, tightly coupled human socio-ecological system, where we're at a global scale, we're interconnected and interdependent. And I think maybe we just haven't realized that so much. We're connected individually, our movement's connected, our food, our goods, our services, our information are all deeply connected and interdependent. And our individual and then it becomes our individual and collective responsibility to address issues due to that interconnectivity. The Club of Rome nicely summarized this problem by arguing that we're moving from what used to be, so think thousands of years ago, an empty world dominated by nature to a full world dominated by humans. So in the empty world, labor and infrastructure were the limiting factors of human well-being. In the full world, where we're at now, the limiting factors of human well-being are the natural resources and environmental sinks that we tap into. So how do we start to address where we're at on climate, on inequity, on just kind of the broad set of socioeconomic and environmental imbalances that we're facing? One is that human capital, for example, healthy citizens, is in many cases undervalued. And natural capital, such as healthy ecosystems, is often not valued at all. And given that we have a market system, it makes sense that with the market guiding our production and consumptions and price signals being what they are, that we shouldn't be surprised in the existing intertwined kind of mess that we're in, because it's the logical consequence of the market sending signals to all the players in a way that proves that the markets work. So in economic theory, you would just talk about externalities, that costs that do exist, those human costs, those natural costs that do exist, and we perhaps deny and we don't account for when we produce and consume something, that they're very real costs, and somewhere, somehow, they have to be paid for. And a lot of times we're saying that those are going to be paid for by the next generation. So the core of any partnership addressing these issues, sustainable consumption and production, or the circular economy, has to embrace a new perspective, a new way to look at that tangle of interdependency. And so I would say there are two principles that what generally undergirds most of the relationships and partnerships that we work on. First is the principle that sustainable development, with a focus on urgent management of global warming and species loss, has to be seen as a profitable investment into long-term successful innovations, not seen as a cost. And I think the previous speaker was speaking to this, that if you're thinking about laws and regulations as your reason to work on these topics, then you've missed the boat here. This has actually got to be seen as an innovation opportunity, a first to market opportunity instead of a cost. And the second, sustainable development based on smart resource management, is the new investment and innovation paradigm that will determine business and countries' competitiveness. So where are we on the journey? I think there are a lot of positive developments, so I'm not going to be comprehensive here at all. And I think PACE's existence, so the organization that I run's existence, is one of those examples. The simple fact that we have a coalition of 100 public and private leaders from around the world working on circularity is an example in and of itself of the momentum. But a few kind of broader examples are, in this last climate COP in November, over 70 countries out of the 120 that updated their NDCs, so their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, over 70 of them incorporated circularity and material use and efficiency in their indices. This was a huge step, a over 6-time or 5-time increase from the previous round. In February, so just 2 months ago, at the UN Environment Program's General Assembly, they approved the member states that are part of the UN Environment Program, approved the move to move into negotiations to develop a global treaty on plastics and focusing on single-use plastics. And then we're seeing alliances similar to PACE and in different formats, forming in different regions. So in Latin America, for example, there's a coalition of governments working on circular economy. In Africa as well, hosted by the African Development Bank, and their longer term existing coalitions and alliances in Southeast Asia and East Asia. So what's happening in your industry, in the built environment and construction, across commercial, housing, infrastructure, et cetera? We could kind of go into those different areas and look at it differently. But I'll just start with some general points. And first here, I'll be clear, like I used to tell the graduate students when I taught, I reserve the right to not know everything and to make mistakes. So I hope we keep the Q&A friendly when we get into your industry details, because it's not my specific area of expertise. But what I often hear in our work around buildings and housing infrastructure is really in the context of energy efficiency, given that energy efficiency counts for, or energy related CO2 emissions from the built environment contribute about 40% of the total. So embodied carbon, though, wasn't really on the agenda until about 5 years ago. But I think we're at a real moment of opportunity where it's really starting to become a closer to mainstream topic. So, but what is projected by 2050, I gave some general statistics on our resource use, but by 2050, global demand for industrial materials such as steel, cement, and aluminum are projected to increase by a factor of 2 to 4 by 2050. So even if you take the materials that are the kind of core materials of your industry, we're still looking at a doubling to quadrupling of that material use. And in my experience, that usually the approach taken by a lot of what I would call impact-driven PPPs, meaning you've got a very specific outcome target like emissions reduction or avoidance, is to target the bad actor. So we look at the problem as a steel problem or a cement problem, but construction and infrastructure, I think, really present the world with a unique set of issues, especially given that it's a local industry. So the building regulations, these are things you know better than I do, but for those among us who might not be as familiar, building regulations tend to be set at a national level, but ambitions and process, for example, like permitting, are set at the local level. So we can't approach circularity or systems type changes in this sector the same way we do in others, like in textiles, where we can engage primarily at a national level, and we can engage maybe industry aggregators because a lot of the throughput of the material comes through a smaller group of partners. There I use like plastics as the opposite example of the built environment, where you can get together in a room, companies that represent 20-30% of the actual material production in the world. And so you can really start to address issues if you can get that group to work together. The built environment is just a really different situation, which So let me just say a few things that I think we can do that can make sure that when we look at circular economy, it's more of a fit for purpose approach for the built environment. One is that every city and region, from my viewpoint, needs a life cycle or materials roadmap. Cities tend to have a pathway towards operating emissions, but material use continues to go up and hasn't reduced much, or not at all when it comes to cement and glass. But there are technologies available and they're not being used because of cost incentives, et cetera. So I think this type of road mapping and life cycle approach can really help at the city level. And Amsterdam is a great example. One of our partners, Circle Economy here, has helped them with something they call their city scan tool. And they come in and they do an assessment of the material flow happening within a specific city or region. And they did that for Amsterdam. And of course, they find out that organics of food waste value chains and construction are the two primary areas where there's an opportunity for action and also massive impact in the city. And when their findings included that if they took action in those two areas, just in the construction sector, that they could create about $85 million of value per year by applying circular business models and create up to 700 additional jobs in the sector. And so I would refer you to their report. Again, it's Circle Economies. The report, I think, is called Circular Amsterdam. The second thing that I would point you towards is looking at new financing and collaboration models built around local networks. So one example here in Europe is a new initiative called Built by Nature that's been sponsored by a philanthropy called Loudis Foundation. And they're looking to promote the expansion of mass timber buildings, not circular in and of itself, even though it could be part of a circular solution. But the interesting thing about it is instead of starting at these kind of national level coalitions, they're starting at a city level with local industry partners and regional industry partners instead of going to, say, a global engineering firm or an advisory firm. They're going really local, establishing local connections, local kind of hub type approach, similar to like World Resources Institute and other partners. Cities are, Buildings Accelerator is what it's called. So I think that's a really interesting model to think about your industry or the kind of product line that you might be in, and is there an approach that you could copy there? And what they're doing is setting up what might have a centralized financing mechanism, but then having localized blended financing models to help companies step in and test out these different approaches. The third is easy to access tools, obviously. So I'd point you to one example, which is Arup, the engineering firm, has a tool called the Circular Buildings Toolkit, which they developed with a group of their partners. It's another great resource. And it's a kind of consistently updated platform that includes case studies and tools to help support you and your team in applying circularity to your projects. The fourth, and I'll just kind of go to two more points. The fourth is looking at different approaches by the market. So, for example, a simple, significantly underexplored, even in looking at circularity in the built environment, even though that's an emerging topic, but definitely still underexplored, is looking at local construction materials. So rammed earth and aerated concrete, straw as inserts in prefab panels, cross-laminated timber, cross-laminated bamboo, et cetera, and looking at what does a resource efficiency in the built environment look like in a developing economy or a pre-emerging or low-growth middle-income country is really different than, for example, a lot of the examples I'm sharing, which are built in Europe or North America. And then my final point is there's a lot of research and policy questions that need to be addressed. So to highlight a few of those points, one is understanding and mapping out these decarbonization pathways for industries and cities and regions. So if I'm saying cities need these roadmaps, that means they also need to understand what those potential pathways could be for different types of cities or regions. The second is linking together three topics that are often addressed separately. One is buildings, the second is material flows, and the third is waste. Those are often treated as three separate topics, even in communities that we work with. So the whole visual from forests all the way to waste use could be a very compelling piece of research that could help the industry move forward. The next is, how do we create markets for circularity in building materials? So right now there's a lot of global momentum and narrative about translating these concepts for like I was saying, low and middle income countries as well as high growth countries. And so part of that's going to have to be about what's that kind of market opportunity really look like. And then a final one is just the application in low income and affordable housing. I think that's where there's a huge potential. One, because you can use government procurement or blended finance instruments that exist or are proven to test out these models. And oftentimes a lot of the solutions we're talking about do result in kind of lower cost in materials or lower material needs. And then, so where are we going? Let me just highlight a few things, and then we'll open it up. So where are we going? There are a few things that we really want to do. It's pretty exciting. I've been a little bit sick, so I may not sound that excited right now, but we're just at the beginning. We're a long way in, but it's still just the beginning of the level of action that needs to happen, but it's happening. And as PACE last year, our board set out a mission to help double global circularity in the next 10 years in line with the Paris Agreement. Okay, doubling sounds fine in 10 years of anything, but why, if I talk about global circularity being 8.6% and going to 17, why is that interesting? Well, it's because to get there, there's a lot of work to be done because actually the trend is going in the wrong direction. So it's not just about doubling, it's about reversing a trend and then doubling, which is really hard. So what are we doing? First, we need to measure progress, which means when we talk about circularity, if you really want to get down to what we're talking about, you talk about metrics. And there's a lot of metrics out there that are being developed where people are trying to figure this out, both on the industry side, government side, as well as in between. So you could look at WBCSD has a set of metrics called the Circular Transition Indicators. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation has what they call Circulytics indicators. ISO is coming out with new standards on circular metrics. Also, circularity or material flow is being incorporated into a lot of the current thinking on investor-facing ESG metrics, which is something that certainly this industry would need to take care of or take a point of. And then countries and regions, certainly here in Europe, the European Union's Green Deal has a lot of content and metrics around circularity, which include the built environment. So that measurement piece and figuring that out and making sure we're measuring what matters is critical. The second is just translating this work into action. There's nothing like just doing something to make it all make sense. And within our partners, the way that we did that was to bring people together to agree by industry on the top 10 priorities where we need leaders to step in and we need demonstration projects in place, or either examples where there's demonstration that needs to scale. So there you can refer to our action agenda. You can go to our website, pacecircular.org, and see that list of examples there. And in those documents, you'll find over 80 examples of circular economy best practices applied to different industries. And then next is partnerships. And so that's why we're here today. There's no circular approach that can happen by one partner, whether that's in your supply chain or outside of it. And so thanks for having me. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, David. Really appreciate you being here. And you just had some incredibly interesting things to say. I do have a list of questions, and then I'll open it up to Mike for some audience questions as well. As you mentioned in the beginning, in contrast to our current take and waste model, a circular economy is designed to decouple growth from the consumption of finite resources by sharing, leasing, reusing, repairing, refurbishing, and recycling existing materials, natural resources, products, and energy as long as possible. Can you give us some examples of industries that are doing a very good job of implementing circular economy fundamentals?
Yeah, maybe let me give a way to frame the thinking about which industries are leading the way. So one is, one way to think about circular economies, you remember the old 3 R's, reduce, reuse, and recycle. In circular economy, a lot of times we talk about the 9 R's. So you can Google just the 9 R's of the circular economy. And the first is refuse. The next is rethink, reduce, reuse, repair, refurbish, remanufacture, repurpose, then recycle, then recover. And those have a increasing value that I started with the more circular things, the refuse, rethink, reduce, and then you get to the middle, the reuse, repair, refurbish, manufacture, then to the recycling. So what I would say is when thinking about who's leading the way and which industries are doing well, just think about who's doing what at different levels. And I'll say there's no clear industry that's just got it all figured out. So we have classic examples like industrial symbiosis. So, recycling waste or water from production back into production facilities or to another partner. You have, food and beverage companies using food waste from production to produce animal feed, things like that. There are lots of those examples. There's lots of momentum around plastic packaging, but less discussion around durable plastics, which is actually where a lot of the emissions comes from. There's a lot of action in textiles, but not at scale. And recycling certainly continues to be a challenge there. There are bright spots, but not at scale in the energy sector and the built environment and transport. So I guess all that's to say is there are a lot of things happening across the board. I would say no industry could really claim that they're the scion that everyone should follow at this time.
Thanks, David. I really like the 9 R's, and I love the fact that the first one is refuse. And that brings me to my next question, which is about the market-driven forces. How much is the circular economy and circularity as a concept being driven by the market, and primarily millennials and older Gen Zs, who we know are very mission-driven and values-based? They understand the sharing economy. Many of them have kind of grown up on ride sharing and a very localized version of that circular economy, versus driven by companies that are setting a circular strategy for cost savings and resource efficiency and streamlining supply chains, and in certain cases, perhaps policy and requirements.
Yeah, different companies come to this agenda for different reasons, in the first instance, right? So, even if I look at the origins of PACE, those kind of early days, some companies were looking at, what do I do with SDG 12, which is responsible consumption and production? Do I have some voluntary or involuntary reporting requirement or thing that I should be considering? Some qualitative concept I should be considering. Some come to it as an innovation opportunity. So is there a new market here? Is there a way to extend my relationship with a customer by extending the life of my product? And it's, so that's an interesting thing about sharing models or leasing models. Can I go from a one-off transaction to having a 20-year relationship with you? And a good example there is the shift to light as a service. I can sell you light bulbs, or I can sell you light in your office for the next 20 years, and regardless of the light bulb, because you get the service. And then some are actually coming for that material scarcity or risk or supply chain risk. I think what's interesting right now is those things are kind of converging, and we're finding more partners coming to the agenda for all of those reasons. And I'll say I'll just kind of finish with this. There is one reason why we certainly, whether it's the reason why partners come to the agenda, it certainly has to be considered in their circular economy action, which is emissions. And so, knowing that these approaches will either enable or not go against their commitments on climate has been really important. And so we engage in discussions around climate and decarbonization more than any other impact area related to this agenda. 3-4 years ago, that wasn't even kind of the main topic, or not even probably a top 5 topic in circular economy.
Interesting. You mentioned light as a service. I think we're starting to see the very early phases of that in our industry. So things like appliances as a service, or even a house as a service. When you look at some of the models that really innovative prefab home manufacturers like Devell are implementing, where they're really looking at, rather than selling you a home per se, they're selling you the service of a home over time. I think we saw that concept really open up in our sector with solar, with power purchase agreements, so that instead of homeowners or building owners or businesses having to purchase entire solar systems, they could invest basically in solar leases, where the solar companies retained ownership and of the system, the components themselves, and then was in charge of operations and maintenance. So it was just a different model. So I think we're starting to see some of that shift in our industry with companies that are indeed looking at that as an innovative approach for a new type of business model and a new type of ongoing revenue stream. Oh, sorry, did you want to respond?
No, go ahead.
No. Okay, so let me shift gears. I'm interested, how have world events like war and the pandemic impacted the development and the advancement of the circular economy? Have you seen any effect at all?
Well, the war is almost like too big of a topic to touch, so I'll not touch it. But the pandemic, we've had a little bit more time to see it through. So first, I mean, like I mentioned briefly in my talking points, the pandemic, it didn't bring out new issues in the circular economy. What it did is I think it put a lot of those existing issues in sharp relief, or it showed how they could be exacerbated. So our interdependency was already there. Our dependency on having rare earth metals sourced from specific places all the time, and supply chains fitting in very certain ways, the limitations of just-in-time manufacturing and those sorts of issues just exposed the vulnerability of the supply chains that we had, and it exposed the interdependence on our human health. And so to that extent, I wouldn't say that the pandemic was something big, and a lot of the short-term shifts that we saw in consumption or consumer behavior, we don't know yet if those are long-term. So, we certainly saw a lot of photos of masks, well, saw a lot of the actual ones, but, masks floating in the ocean. So we had this increase in certain types of single-use materials that, once you put health as a criteria, then, people are at this point can be okay with single-use items. And we also saw shifts in our use of resources, so office space. I'm sitting in an empty office right now, as a simple example. We don't know if that's longer term, so maybe I'll just call back to something I wrote, and then we can think about how that comes out. In about this time, so I think it was May of 2019, I wrote an article directed towards the EU, who was considering the new stimulus package under the Green Deal, and saying, how could they think about circular economy in the light of the stimulus package investments? And one was to use the green stimulus packages to ensure progress on the circular economy was not reversed by the COVID-19 crisis. The second was promoting more resilient safeguards against resource shortages and supply chain risk. And then the third was promoting European kind of global leadership on the circular economy through more cross-sector cooperation. In general, those are the kind of the generic way to say it. You can see that, read the article in your active. But in general, I would say we had the positive influence, meaning like that the issues were brought into sharp relief by COVID. That has continued to be in sharp relief today, right? So we're still 3 years on. The pandemic has not gone away, but we've moved our, companies have started to figure out their supply chains and other things, but we were able to see some, able to continue the momentum of the discussions we were having as a result of the pandemic. And I think that's helped us in a way, not to say that it made good of the pandemic.
Thanks, David. Let's talk about innovation and technology advancements. What does circularity innovation look like? And talk about the evolution of circular products and solutions.
Yeah, maybe I'll say one way to think about it is everything we're talking about is innovation. If you use the most generic definition of innovation being something that's new to you, then if you don't have a circular business, then it's all innovation, right? So, and like I was saying, a lot of people coming to this work are talking about innovative business models. And so introducing those into new markets or new industries is important. Like you're talking about sharing. Well, sharing of office furniture is not new. Sharing of lighting is. Sharing of capital assets is. So that's an existing business model applied to a new product or a new product class. So I'd say any kind of innovation approach applies, but maybe I'll just emphasize the digital side of innovation. So one, sensors, for example, looking at sensing parameters, looking at the identification of objects becoming really important. You see that in recycling, you see these scanners going through and identifying the different the materials that are in composite products. And so the use of sensors is a big discussion. Looking at big data, so big data driven, sustainability insights, how to understand and enhance product life cycles requires certainly big data and integration of diverse data across different types of supply chains, across different kinds of data repositories and users is important. We've seen the blockchain being used a lot around transparency and communication, supply chain performance, like group decision making, and creating incentive mechanisms. So where you have distributed supply chains, especially distributed use. So can you use the blockchain to help globally located users determine what to do with their kind of end of life products and where to send them? And then applications of things like AI and similar in decision support systems and information mining, intelligence, et cetera. So I think really across the board, because it's an innovative approach, you can look at all the emerging and existing technologies and there are ways that they're being applied across the board.
Thanks, David. Yeah, we're keeping our eye on things like artificial intelligence, AI, and blockchain as well, particularly in the building sector, to facilitate circularity, resource efficiency, and just streamlining, construction projects and job site functions. Right. So that's pretty interesting.
If I can give just a basic visual. In the US, on the back of food products, you have food labels, right? And it tells you the contents of the product. So how do you have that for a building? So imagine if you could just visualize that label on the side of your house, and it would tell you not only have to say how much copper is in the house, it'd have to say copper alloyed with this, and there's this much, and that's there, and it's located in that wall, but and it's got this red wire, right? So that when you go to disassemble the house, you can actually extract out and mine those different materials. Well, that's interesting if you could slap it on one house. Now you need to slap the label on every house, and you need to put it on maybe infrastructure that exists, like the house that was built 100 years ago. And then you need to give a city insight into that data so that they know the infrastructure, and you need businesses to know what the throughput's going to be of that. So that's really what we're kind of talking about, is that a simple concept of knowing what's in a building is easy when you think of the new things. Really hard when you think of all the composites and you think of things that might exist.
It's a beautiful vision, and it is in such a nascent phase in the building industry. We are starting to see things like environmental product declarations, or EPDs, for products in certain categories. We're about to launch a 220 home community demonstration project with a leading kind of high performance healthy home builder, community builder called Thrive, and the Front Range in Colorado up in Fort Collins. And one of our goals with that is to have that kind of reporting. Unfortunately, we're going to fall short because it just doesn't exist, right? Like there's no EPDs in the door category, right? There's just no companies that have, in that category yet. Now I know there are some that are working on it, and we're doing everything we can to help expedite that. But truly, I think your vision of, being able to see all the inputs of a house and understand, what the inputs are, what the circularity elements are, what the health impacts are, what the energy and water use and conservation components of that house is. I mean, that's really that's advanced thinking in this sector. But you know, I'm hoping that due to your efforts and Pace's efforts and other folks in the circular economy sector will translate over into our industry. I have just a couple more questions. Oh, I'm sorry.
If you want to know how that's happening today, then again, Google's wonderful, or your preferred search engine. Just look at Europe product passports.
Okay.
And you'll see the regulations that are coming out now, and you'll also see work on batteries, so I think batteries for EVs, one of our partners called the Global Battery Alliance has been working on this, is what's an appropriate kind of labeling system for batteries so that you can disassemble. Again, these are small examples, but that is a complex supply chain that does have relevance, say, to the energy systems going into buildings, and could be a way to stimulate the discussion.
Great, thank you. I will definitely Google that, and I encourage everyone else to Google Europe product passports. Clearly, as you said, Europe is so far ahead of us in terms of this, but hopefully we can catch up quickly. Here in the US, can you talk about obstacles? You know, what are the obstacles involved in developing circular economies? You talked about how they're very localized in some ways, but yet we need policy at a national level. You know, can you give some examples of countries, companies, or sectors that have overcome those obstacles that we can look at as case studies?
Yeah, I mean, there's on one hand, there's a plethora of examples. One, I pointed you to this action agenda that you can see on our website. What we did there was try to lay out by industry what the key barriers are. So getting agreement on those cross-cutting issues like externalities not being accounted for, which I referenced earlier, looking at lack of incentives to design for extended useful life, limited access to circular design know-how, those sorts of kind of cross-cutting issues, and then industry-specific areas. Like in some, like at textiles, for example, there's a high sensitivity to higher prices for fibers. Great, you might say that in construction as well. There's a high sensitivity to certain price fluctuations, but not others. And then we lay out the kind of specific actions to be taken by industry. What I would say is that to your point of where there are, I don't know if I can give a perfect example from the US, but where there are really good examples are, you know, I mentioned this 9 R's before. Another way that gets visualized sometimes, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation does this, they call it the butterfly diagram. It's got 2 circles. One is the kind of biosphere, the other is the technical sphere, so hard materials and products. And how do those loop back? And the middle 9, the middle of those 9 R's are in the middle, the reuse, remanufacturing, et cetera. That's where most of the barriers and obstacles are being addressed right now. On those monostream products like plastics, there's a lot being addressed in the recycling area, looking at infrastructure. So different types of products and materials. So the FMCG companies are working there, and then they're working on the recycling part. There's not a lot of happening in the middle area. So what I would say is, depending on the industry, the focus has really been on finding solutions in different parts as opposed to looking at kind of the holistic system, which is where our role comes in.
Thanks, David. I have one more question, and then I'm going to kick it back over to Mike because I know he has a couple questions from the audience. Here in the US, you know, we see some actions being taken on a state level, for example, in California, to ban various different types of single-use plastics in general. And we're starting to see some of that, you know, on the coasts more than anywhere else, perhaps where I am in Colorado as well. What do you see with respect to policy and regulations here in the US that are impactful for circularity? Do you think circularity as a concept is even really on the minds of policymakers at this point? Or do you feel like there's a lot of kind of education that still needs to be affected here?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the U.S., what you're identifying is not necessarily strange or unique of various different types of things that need to be addressed in the U.S., but because of the political structure. And so it might seem like things can progress in European countries differently, but it's because they don't have the federal structure in the government. And so decision making, there is a lot of different types of decisions that can be made at a national level. And the countries that are exceptions to that have stronger leadership at the regional level. So I would more think of the U.S. in the context of, say, Canada, where you've got a lot more provincial level decision making than national decision making. And so circularity, I think, is going to be important to be a state agenda. And there are states, and I would say New York, by the way, is a leading state on the topic. Pennsylvania and Philadelphia are looking at it more. There's been a lot of discussions around the Midwest, and even with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation looking at some initiatives around circularity in the Midwest. So I think that's it. I think that's going to be the key for the U.S. is figuring out what that state-led agenda is. And groups at the federal government side, I can say we've had not just robust discussions, but we've also seen very tangible action. For example, in the EPA, looking at government procurement of electronics. That's something that's within their remit, and it's something where they've got a robust system and approach they're working on. It can be improved. For this last campaign and in the current administration, there's discussions, even to the White House on this topic. And it's becoming a little bit more of a part of the conversation in the kind of 3Ds, the development diplomacy and well, not defense, not the third D. But and then a final point, you're definitely seeing, say, the U.S. government step up its work in plastics at the federal level. So even with USAID, the aid agency for the U.S. government, looking at programming overseas in plastic waste. So I wouldn't ding the U.S. for being too far behind, but I would say there's a lot of need for state level mobilization.
Thanks so much, David. And Mike, I'm going to hand it off to you to ask some audience questions.
Yeah, we've got a couple, David, if you don't mind. William sent in 2 questions. First is, do you know of anyone being an individual or entity, who is integrating both decarbonization and adaptation into their building decisions?
Decarbonization and adaptation into their building decisions? I don't, and I think this is where I call on my previous ability to say I don't know. Yeah, not that I can think of. I would probably have to be given a more specific example, but nothing comes immediately to mind. Sorry about that.
Oh, it's okay. It's okay.
Yeah.
The other question he had was, service business models. He feels they're a start, but he's wondering if these actually accelerate wealth retention by the asset owners versus the users or the tenants.
Well, I mean, depends on how you value the asset and what the, accounting, it can be quite different. There's possibilities for it too, yeah. So I think it depends on the product class. The question is what the goal is trying to do. So if I think of my, most of the things that we're talking about here, my washing machine or my car, those are not necessarily assets that increase in value over time, but it doesn't mean that the actual component materials don't increase. And as an individual user, I don't have an ability to monetize that material. So the question is can I receive the same service and perhaps get a little bit lower cost over the lifespan of the product or over its useful life, and someone actually then extract the value out of those materials. So I think it's to the economic modeling and costing for the customer themselves to figure out that price parity. So there are examples, of course, where you could see that someone retains an asset and charges an exorbitant price. But I wouldn't presume that every shared model is more expensive than a non-shared model. And I'll give a simple example. I don't own a car. We live in the Netherlands. It's quite a different environment when it comes to infrastructure and other things. But we do use two different shared car approaches. But if you looked at the per use for the shared car, it looks crazy sometimes. I went to the store and it cost, I used the shared car and it cost $20 or $25 to go to the store and back. Well, that looks expensive if you think about needing a car every single day, all day, and you actually fully utilize it. It's actually really inexpensive when I look at our overall use of a vehicle for the year. So in our situation with that current pricing, it really does make sense. And I think that's really where, when you kind of extrapolate these business models out to scale, the markets, I think, will start to correct where there are abnormalities of kind of profit being stuck in the wrong place.
And do you find that affects behavior then too? You know, that per use cost there that you're talking about with the shared car?
Does it impact my personal behavior?
Yeah.
Yeah, it can, but not really, not because I sit down and I can do the calculations. So I think that's up to the marketing and the customer and the company to do that as well. Other examples would be like bulk purchasing instead of buying individual products. So your grocery store shifting to bulk purchases and bringing in reusable packaging instead of buying it in an existing package. On one hand, the company saves on transport of individual packages. They save on packaging cost as well. They'll figure out their business model. And if it seems like that bulk packaging costs more, then the market should correct back to where it should be. And you might need some government policy and regulation in places to make sure that the incentives, disincentives are directing the producer behavior as well as the consumer behavior in the right direction. Maybe let me just finish with one point in circular when it comes to this. I think we can't put the burden for these changes on the individual. In some instances, there is a role for the individual to play in making these decisions, but given options, you can't expect people who are kind of facing financial restraints to make financial choices that are difficult when they don't have alternative options. And so I think that's where we get to a real market system working and making sure that there are viable options available. And that's where incentives and disincentives start to come in.
Well, I know we could talk about this topic for quite a while, but we do need to get to our final panel of this year's symposium. And so I want to thank you for your time, David. I hope you get to feeling better. Thank you for joining us all the way over from The Hague. And any final comment?
No, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me today. It's been good.
All right. Thank you, sir.